The sweeping victory of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of former dictator Ferdinand Marcos, in the presidential election on May 9th is a testimony to the structural change the Philippines politics has undergone in over 3 decades. The Philippines presidential election, according to analysts, was the most significant election in the Southeast Asian nation's recent history. The first frontrunner was Ferdinand Marcos Jr., popularly known as Bongbong, and the namesake of the father. The second was Leni Robredo, the current vice president and head of the opposition, who had promised a more accountable and transparent government to reinvigorate the country's democracy. Ferdinand Marcos, the full name is Ferdinand Edralin Marcos, was born on September 11, 1917 in Sarrat, Philippines, and died on September 20, 1989 in Hawaii, US. He was a Filipino politician, lawyer, dictator, and kleptocrat, and was the 10th president of the Philippines from 1965 to 1986. His authoritarian regime in the Philippines had come under criticism for corruption and for its suppression of democratic processes. It was even accused of stealing billions from the state coffers. He was president twice before declaring martial law. He took the years-long people power revolution, which was triggered by the assassination of opposition leader Benigno Aquino Jr. in 1983 to overthrow the dictatorship in 1986. 36 years later, Mr. Marcos Jr., who has never disowned the abuse of his father's regime, got 30.5 million votes out of 67 million votes polled as per unofficial results, compared with 14.5 million votes secured by Vice President Maria Leonor Robredo, his closest rival. Mr. Marcos Jr.'s victory may seem an irony, but it is not surprising. The Marcos family, which returned to the country in 1991 after 6 years in exile, had immediately started to regain its lost glory and influence. The dictator's wife, Imelda, contested in the 1992 presidential election and lost, but Mr. Marcos Jr. has been active in politics since the late 1990s. Now, with his thumping victory in one of the most constitutional elections in the post-dictatorship era, the once humiliated family is poised to determine the Southeast Asian nation's future once again. Now, what are Mr. Marcos Jr.'s policy preferences? Not much is known about it. He evaded presidential debates and refused to give media interviews. Instead, he gave direct addresses to his supporters, and his team ran a highly efficient online campaign. The online campaign was cautiously focused on depicting the era of dictatorship as one of the prosperity and opportunity. This appeared to have appealed to the voters. He joined hands too with the outgoing president Rodrigo Duterte, whose daughter Sarrat Duterte Carpio became his running mate. 6 years ago, Mr. Duterte ran a similar campaign. He blamed pro-democracy establishment parties for the poverty and widening inequality. Outgoing President Rodrigo Duterte had left office with a reputation of brutality, economic incompetence, and crackdowns on media and his critics. His signature drug war is being investigated by the International Criminal Court. Duterte had also been criticized for his handling of the coronavirus pandemic, which had killed at least 60,439 people in the nation. Once in power, he attacked the country's institutions, launched a war on drugs in which thousands of Filipinos were killed, and ordered the burial of the senior Marcos body at Heroes Cemetery. Mr. Marcos Jr.'s refusal to distance himself from his family's political legacy and his joining hands with the Dutertes have fanned concerns over the future of democracy. Given the 6 years of Mr. Duterte's rule, such fears were not completely baseless. In his first remarks after the election, Mr. Marcos Jr. asked the public to judge him by his actions and not by his ancestors. If he is serious, the presidency is his opportunity to prove his critics wrong. He can do so by recovering the billions looted during his father's regime, strengthening institutional democracy and restoring accountability among the political class.